On a quiet September night in Tecumseh, Michigan, a man dialed 911 with panic shaking in his voice. He said his wife had just killed herself in their basement. But when first responders rushed into that small green house on Burt Street, something felt wrong instantly. The screaming sounded rehearsed. The tears weren't real, and the woman he claimed had hanged herself. Her body didn't match the story he was telling. Amy Allen, a shy 34-year-old mother who spent her life avoiding conflict, had been found with an extension cord around her neck in a basement, too short to even allow a full hanging. This is the story of a mother who tried to quietly navigate her life, a woman too gentle to fight back, and the shocking moment her husband claimed she hanged herself in a room where gravity simply disagreed. The truth of what happened to Amy Allen didn't begin in that basement. It began in a small Florida town far from the headlines, in a life shaped by quietness, early responsibility, and the kind of softness that made her easy to overlook but impossible not to love once you truly knew her. When Amy was just 13 years old, her life changed forever. She became pregnant while still in middle school, giving birth to her son Caleb by the time she reached 8th grade. It was a moment that forced her to grow up before she even understood what adulthood required. Her parents stepped in to help raise the baby, doing everything they could to prevent their daughter's life from collapsing under the weight of that responsibility. Caleb grew up with a mother who was barely old enough to attend her own school functions, and Amy grew up with a quiet guilt, a constant feeling that she needed to be perfect just to make up for a childhood cut short. She never complained. She never resented her situation. She never pushed back. That would become a pattern. By high school, Amy had settled into a shy, introverted rhythm. She didn't seek attention. She didn't rebel. She stayed home, focused on Caleb, and kept to herself. And that was when she met a boy who wasn't shy at all. His name was James David Allen, though everyone called him Jimmy, and he was everything Amy wasn't. Loud, confident, structured, a self-described type A personality who believed in rules, discipline, ambition, and control. Jimmy took an interest in her immediately. He wasn't scared off by the fact that she was a teenage mother. In fact, he seemed proud of it, telling people he accepted her completely, that her past didn't bother him. To a young girl who had learned to shrink herself to avoid conflict, that acceptance felt like rescue. Amy got pregnant again at 19. Jimmy proposed. She said yes, and they married quickly. Their daughter, Ashley, was born before Amy had turned 20. And just like that, she slipped into a full-time role as a stay-at-home mother of 2. Her life revolved around their needs. She cooked, she cleaned, she obeyed, she did what she was told. And slowly, almost invisibly, Jimmy's acceptance of her past turned into control over her present. Amy's mother later said she always felt there was more to Amy's decision to stay home than personal choice. She believed Jimmy didn't want Amy entering the working world, didn't want her gaining independence or meeting new people. He preferred things neat, organized, predictable, and controlled. By 2017, after nearly 2 decades of life in Florida, the family moved to Tecumseh, Michigan. Jimmy had landed what he described as his dream job, producing video content for an audio accessories company in nearby Ann Arbor. It was a fresh start for him, but for Amy, the move created more distance from her family, more isolation, less support, and fewer people who truly knew her. In Michigan, she was reinvented as the quiet wife of an ambitious, structured man. But isolation has a way of exposing cracks. Caleb, now older, could no longer tolerate the endless rules and constant tension. When he reached 17, he left the house and moved in with his grandparents. Amy's family hoped she might eventually leave too, or at least reassert herself. Instead, a few months later, after a heated argument inside the home, Jimmy told Amy she needed to cut off contact with her parents and her son entirely. Text messages later recovered from Amy's phone revealed the result of that ultimatum. Amy telling her family she could not visit. Amy telling them Jimmy didn't want Caleb in their Michigan home. Amy apologizing over and over, as though she were the one who had caused the rift. She wasn't, but controlled people often blame themselves for their own captivity. Jimmy's control extended far beyond family relationships. He monitored Amy's movements. She was expected to keep her phone's location accessible to him at all times. He limited her social media usage. He restricted her from playing video games online. He chose what the family ate, what time chores were done, how the home was run. Even small, harmless decisions required Jimmy's approval. Amy lived in the same house as her husband, but not in the same freedom. The affair lasted almost 3 years. But the most shocking part wasn't the length of it, it was how deeply she hid it. Even on the day she died, September 14th, 2018 started like a normal Friday. Their daughter, Ashley, had a football game that night. Amy and Jimmy drove her there, and then decided to get drinks downtown. They went first to Embers, then to JR's Hometown Grill, casual places, small town crowded, the kind of bars where everyone sees you walking in. What happened inside, however, was anything but casual. Jimmy started talking about moving south again. He wanted to sell their Michigan house, move to North Carolina, start fresh. Amy didn't want to. This was the first time in years she had an opinion that directly contradicted his wish for the family. And when he insisted, Amy didn't cave. She grabbed her phone, began texting, and responded to him with a cold, almost dismissive comment. "I hope that works out for you." To most people, that would sound like mild sarcasm. To Jimmy, it was an attack on control itself. He later said that one sentence undermined their entire future. Their argument escalated. Amy became distant, irritated, annoyed, something she rarely allowed herself to be in his presence. That alone was telling. And Jimmy, the man who controlled every aspect of their home, felt the grip loosening. Minutes later, Amy told him she was walking home. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't negotiate. She simply left. She walked alone through the Tecumseh streets, the evening air cool, the sky getting dimmer. She arrived home around 7:58 p.m. Jimmy arrived minutes later by car. According to him, Amy went straight to the basement carrying an extension cord. Why she would do that right after an argument was never fully explained. Jimmy claimed he checked on her around 8:05 p.m., finding her feeding one of their 5 cats and accusing him of slamming the bar door on purpose. They argued again. 10 minutes, maybe less. He said she was still alive, still angry, still moving around the basement. He then claimed he went upstairs to watch Ace Ventura, not to cool down, not to reconcile, but to watch a comedy film while his wife sat alone in the basement after a fight. He said that around 8:40 p.m., after almost 30 minutes of isolation and tension, he went downstairs to make peace, to reconnect before picking up their daughter from the football game. What he claimed he found next became the narrative he repeated for years. Amy hanging from an extension cord, unconscious, unresponsive, and lifeless. But the basement had a secret he didn't consider, a secret that would later destroy his story completely. What actually happened between 8:05 and 8:40 remains unknown, but what is documented is this. When Jimmy dialed 911 moments later, the panic in his voice was loud, dramatic, almost theatrical. He screamed that his wife had killed herself. But when Officer B.J. Horn entered the house, he didn't hear panic. He didn't feel chaos. He felt silence, too much silence. And when he reached the basement, he saw a husband performing CPR with frantic, exaggerated motions that didn't match his dry eyes. No tears, no real grief, only noise. Everything about that basement scene felt wrong. The knots on the cord too loose, the ceiling too low, the husband too emotional in the performative sense, yet not emotional at all in the human sense. Amy was rushed to the hospital. A faint pulse returned, but she never woke up. The basement where Amy Allen was found became the central battlefield of the entire investigation, because nothing about what happened in that cramped space made sense. Nothing matched Jimmy Allen's story, and as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a truth that was colder, darker, and far more calculated than a moment of desperation. When Detective Larry Rothman took over the case, he didn't walk into it expecting foul play. He didn't walk into it assuming a husband had murdered his wife. But within hours of reviewing the scene photographs, the 911 call, and the timeline provided by Jimmy, he felt something twist in his gut, a hard, unmistakable feeling that something was off. The basement ceiling stood only about 7 feet high. It was low enough that anyone, even moderately tall, could reach the beams without stretching. Amy was 5'6". Her shoes lay neatly to the side, untouched. The cord, Jimmy claimed she had looped around, her neck was thin, worn, and already slightly stretched. Nothing about it suggested it could hold the weight of a grown woman suspended above the ground. He ordered a forensic engineering lab to recreate every detail Jimmy had described. The cord, the knot, the height, the weight, the slack, the tension. The scientist overseeing the tests, a materials expert named Elizabeth Buck, approached the task purely through physics, through numbers, angles, elasticity, force. Her findings were devastating for Jimmy's narrative. Once Amy's approximate weight was applied, the cord stretched enough that her feet would have been flat on the ground, not dangling, not suspended, not hanging. There was no way, no physical possibility, that Amy had lifted herself off the ground long enough, or high enough, to die by hanging. And the knots that first responders described as loose would have been pulled so tight they'd require a cutting tool to remove, yet they weren't. They were still loose when police cut her down. The evidence pointed not to a suicide attempt that failed, but to staging, rushed, clumsy attempt to create a scene. One that didn't match gravity, anatomy, or the fear imprinted inside a dying person. The autopsy found something else, a fracture in the thyroid cartilage. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was there. Internal injury consistent with significant pressure to the neck. To the defense, this fracture wasn't definitive. To the prosecution, it was a clue, a whisper inside Amy's body, telling investigators she was held, squeezed, forced into unconsciousness long before any cord was placed around her neck. The first responders who arrived at the scene noticed something too. There were no obvious marks, no deep grooves, no signs typically found in a hanging victim. The cord around her neck was loose, so loose that at least one EMT commented on it immediately. Detective Rothman built a theory. The fight at the bar didn't end when they got home. It carried into the basement, into the cold, quiet space where Amy fed one of their cats. Words escalated, voices rose, rage swelled, and at some point, Jimmy wrapped his arm around her neck, maybe in an attempt to silence her, maybe in an attempt to intimidate her, or maybe in a flash of anger that spiraled out of control. Caleb, her son, later testified that Jimmy had once used a chokehold on him when he was younger during an argument. Not a playful hold, not a quick grab, but a real chokehold, an arm wrapped across his throat from behind, squeezing hard enough that he panicked. The method was familiar, the maneuver was known. The possibility that he used the same hold on his wife felt chillingly plausible. Maybe Jimmy didn't mean to kill her, maybe he did. No one but Amy and Jimmy will ever know exactly what happened in those minutes. But what was clear, what no scientist or expert could deny, was that Amy did not hang herself. And when her body went limp, when her pulse slipped away, Jimmy panicked. Not the panic of a terrified husband losing the love of his life, but the panic of a man who had to make everything look like something else. The cord, the upturned litter bucket he claimed she'd used as a step, the frantic, overdone theatrics at the scene, the odd frustrations when told she still had a faint pulse, and the chilling detail that Amy's family wasn't informed of her condition until 14 hours later, long after others knew. The deeper the investigation went, the darker Jimmy Allen appeared. Detectives uncovered a pattern of control so severe it bordered on emotional imprisonment. Amy's world had shrunk in the years before her death. Her phone use was monitored, her social media was limited, her friends were gone, her family was cut out. Her decisions were second to Jimmy's. But while Amy's freedoms shrank, her secret relationship grew. And that relationship, in the prosecution's view, might have been the spark that ignited Jimmy's rage. On the day she died, Amy had been texting George constantly. Their messages weren't vague or cautious, they were intimate, direct, emotional, and for the first time in a long time, Amy was planning something for herself, something separate from her husband's grip. "I love you too," she'd answered George earlier that day. "I'm ready to spend time with you in person." Did Jimmy see the messages? Did he suspect? Or did he simply feel her slipping away, in a way he couldn't control or stop? The prosecutors believed that Jimmy sensed something was wrong in his marriage long before that night. They believed losing control over her emotionally, physically, psychologically, was something he couldn't tolerate. And when the tension reached a breaking point in that basement, it snapped into violence. For Jimmy, however, the story he told didn't budge. He insisted Amy had become depressed, overwhelmed, lost inside guilt and secrecy. He said she had struggled with social anxiety and alcohol, that she had carried the crushing weight of her affair, that the argument that night, mixed with everything she'd been hiding, pushed her into a silent, desperate act. The trial became a tug-of-war over which story sounded more like truth and which one sounded like fiction. In September 2021, the courtroom filled with witnesses. First responders described Jimmy's behavior. Police officers described the contradictions. Experts described the impossible physics. Amy's son described the chokehold and the family's rigid rules. The defense leaned heavily on Dr. Francisco Diaz, The forensic pathologist they had prepared to testify that Amy's death was most consistent with a low suspension hanging, but the doctor suffered a medical emergency days before he was scheduled to appear. He was hospitalized and heavily medicated. There were fears he might need surgery, and the trial couldn't stall. Forever jurors were exhausted, tensions were high, and COVID restrictions were still shaping the pace of the court. The defense had to make a choice: delay the trial and risk losing their only expert testimony entirely, or submit Dr. Diaz's written opinion and hope it would sway the jurors. They chose the latter. The prosecution attacked it. They showed that Dr. Diaz hadn't considered the forensic engineering analysis. They pointed out that other experts had disagreed with his assessment, and while his letter cast doubt, it didn't overturn the mountain of evidence showing the hanging was staged. After nearly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. No premeditation, they decided. No planning, but also no suicide. No accident, no moment of weakness. It was murder born out of rage, control, and a night that spiraled from an argument into something deadly. When Jimmy Allen heard the verdict, he broke down. Reporters said he bawled uncontrollably, shaking, sobbing, pleading with the judge for forgiveness. A month later, he was sentenced to 22-45 years in prison. Yet, even after prison doors closed behind Jimmy Allen, the case wasn't done. He appealed. He fought. He insisted he did not kill his wife. He claimed mistakes, missteps, oversights. But the appellate court held firm. The evidence wasn't perfect. The science wasn't flawless. But the truth was clear. Amy didn't walk into that basement to end her life. She walked into it during an argument she never walked out of. And the man who claimed she took her own life was the only one who stood to gain from the lie. Even after the verdict, even after Jimmy Allen was locked behind bars, the shadow of Amy Allen's death refused to lift. The case had been solved in court, but the full story still haunted everyone who had watched it unfold. The appellate process had begun in 2024, a new chapter in a saga that never truly ended. Jimmy's attorneys argued that he had been denied his constitutional right to present a full defense. They claimed ineffective assistance of counsel. They said the trial had ignored newly discovered evidence and insisted that the jury had not been able to consider every alternative explanation for Amy's death. At the center of these claims was Dr. Francisco Diaz, the forensic pathologist who could not testify live during the trial. The appeals court had to weigh one fundamental question: had Jimmy Allen been prevented from presenting the truth, or had his legal team made a reasonable, strategic choice under impossible circumstances? When Dr. Diaz had fallen ill, the defense faced a critical decision. They could delay the trial, risking the loss of other witnesses and jeopardizing the agreement to allow the opinion letter to be read to the jury. Or they could proceed, submitting his written assessment instead of live testimony. They chose the latter, and the appellate court agreed it was a reasonable decision based on what was known at the time. Even the post-conviction polygraph, administered privately in July 2022, could not sway the court. The results suggested that Jimmy Allen was truthful when denying responsibility, but without court approval and independent verification, it held no weight. And despite his claims about the newly discovered evidence, nothing he presented had the power to change the outcome. The appellate court's ruling was firm, final, and unambiguous. The conviction stood, but legal documents, rulings, and court opinions could never capture the human cost, the way Amy's children navigated a world where their mother was taken violently from them, or how her family learned to breathe in the gaps of absence that she left behind. Caleb, now older, understood in ways he never had as a teenager that his home had been a cage. His mother's death exposed the invisible walls that had confined them all for years. Ashley, the daughter, would grow up always knowing that the person who promised to protect her family had instead destroyed it. For the investigators, the case remained a lesson in the power of small, overlooked details. A 7-foot basement ceiling, a cord that stretched, a loose knot, internal injuries that contradicted the narrative. These were tiny, almost insignificant pieces to the untrained eye, but together they formed a chain of evidence impossible to ignore. The forensic engineer's recreation, the testimony of first responders, Caleb's recollections, all of it painted a picture of staged suicide, of a man attempting to erase the violence of his own hands. Yet the case was also a portrait of human complexity. a story where no one was entirely innocent and no one escaped the weight of failure. Amy had made choices in her life that were secretive, risky, and complicated, including her relationship with George. Jimmy's behavior, controlling and obsessive, created an environment where fear and dominance were constant companions. The tragedy was born from the collision of these lives, constrained and distorted by love, control, betrayal, and silence. The courtroom had heard it all: the text messages, the late-night bar arguments, the choking incident with Caleb, the physics of the hanging, and the experiments proving the impossibility of Jimmy's story. The jury, after nearly 6 hours of deliberation, concluded that the elements pointed inexorably toward homicide, second-degree murder without premeditation, but deliberate enough to seal a fate that would forever scar those left behind. Even now, questions linger. Was Jimmy's final act driven purely by rage, by fear of exposure, by jealousy? Or was it the inevitable result of years of control and suppression that left Amy with no escape? The appeal documents, the forensic reports, the photographs, and the witness statements provide a blueprint of the night, but they can't capture the whispered arguments, the internal struggle, the silent plea of a woman trapped in a marriage that had slowly turned to cage. The forensic dispute over the thyroid cartilage fracture became symbolic of the larger struggle between the prosecution and the defense. The quest to assign meaning to ambiguous evidence, to interpret the body as a witness in a story where words had already failed. The prosecution argued that the fracture, combined with the low ceiling and cord slack, indicated a staged hanging. The defense argued that it was consistent with suicide by low suspension hanging, emphasizing the absence of petechia and lack of visible external injuries. The jury, confronted with these conflicting interpretations, relied on the totality of evidence: behavioral, physical, and circumstantial. What became undeniable, however, was the meticulous nature of the staging. Jimmy had carefully placed the cord, maneuvered the scene, and performed for first responders. The drama, the overacting, the confusion, all of it was calculated to mask what he had done. And yet, even in his effort to deceive, he left traces of truth that forensic science and human observation could not ignore. As the appeal confirmed, the legal system recognized these truths, even when the evidence was imperfect. Jimmy Allen remained in prison, and his conviction stood. But the story left open-ended questions that no court could fully answer. The intimate moments of fear in Amy's basement, the private conversations that escalated to violence, the thoughts that raced through her mind in the last minutes of her life. The human story, complex, messy, and tragic, remained partially obscured, leaving a haunting space for reflection and sorrow. The murder of Amy Allen is a story that lingers, a cautionary tale that refuses to fade, a dark echo of the consequences when control, rage, and secrecy collide, when the person who should be a protector becomes the architect of destruction. Justice may have been served, but the loss remains, and the haunting question that remains in every retelling is simple, terrifying, and eternal. What could have been? If only someone had seen, if only someone had acted sooner, if only the life of Amy Allen had not been stolen in that basement on a September night in Tecumseh, Michigan.